After the war, motorsport restarted using whatever was available. In Italy, the pre-war Alfettas had been well hidden, and in 1950, when the governing body created the Formula One World Championship, Alfa Romeo was ready. The 1.5-litre, 8-cylinder engine, complete with two-stage turbocharging, now produced 370 brake horsepower instead of the 195 produced before the war. It would soon exceed 400. There was another difference. Released by Alfa Romeo, Enzo Ferrari had created his own team. That would become the backbone and be synonymous with Formula One for many years to come. They produced a normally aspirated 4.5-litre V12 which developed 350 brake horsepower. It may have been a little less powerful than the Alfa, but it had the advantage of being somewhat less thirsty, which meant that it could compete a full Grand Prix distance, while its rivals would have to refuel 2 or 3 times. Ferrari's 375 made good use of its advantage in scoring the team's first race win in the championship at the British Grand Prix in 1951, bringing to an end the Alfetta's victorious run. Beaten again in Germany and in Italy, the Alfettas were finally outclassed, and at the end of the 1951 season, Alfa Romeo decided to retire and rest on the laurels of their second world title rather than risk tackling a season too many. It was a blow for the championship, for Ferrari and their star driver Alberto Ascari were virtually without rival. In an effort to boost the fields and future Formula One regulations, the governing body decided to accept Formula 2 cars, but Ferrari were unchallenged. So in 1952, only the impecunious Gordini team attempted to challenge the intensely competitive Scuderia Ferrari, who ran the 500 model powered by a 2-litre 4-cylinder engine. This car would win every Grand Prix of the year, perhaps not as incredible a feat as it might have been, but one that hadn't been repeated 40 years later. The Ferrari 500s did almost as well the following year, but this time their success was more praiseworthy, for Ferrari's quartet of Ascari, Farina, Villaraci and Hawthorn came under increasing pressure from Maserati's Argentine trio of Fangio, Gonzalez and Marimon. And while the title may not have been at risk, Ferrari's 500 ended up giving best to Fangio's Maserati in the final Grand Prix of the year. And that would end Ferrari's monopoly in Grand Prix racing. Over the next few years, Ferrari would be more and more seriously challenged. Mercedes pummeled all opposition into the ground in 1954 and 55, and then Maserati and Van Wall took over in challenging the Scuderia. Then they missed the boat when it came to the technical revolution begun by Cooper at the end of the 50s.
Propose a Ferrari subito di fare la vettura a motore posteriore, ma lui non la volle fare subito perché anche lì lui sentiva l'opinione di tante persone che dicevano che la Ferrari, avendo il motore anteriore di produzione, le vetture di produzione Ferrari avendo motore anteriore, che anche lei guidava, non doveva mai fare una vettura a motore posteriore in corsa perché se vinceva annullava i requisiti benefici della produzione. Mi ricordo il consiglio verso Ferrari del vecchio Taruffi, si ricorda l'ingegnere Taruffi, che lui chiamò per sentire al solito il parere e lui gli disse: ma guardi che qui ormai non c'è niente da fare, la strada è quella del motore posteriore, è inutile, non si può chiamare. E allora dette il permesso di fare la vettura a motore posteriore.
Ferrari's about turn coincided with the introduction of new Formula One regulations in 1961, engines limited to 1.5 litres unsupercharged. Ferrari's 156, powered by a V6 more powerful than the English 4-cylinders and characterised by its shark nose, would redress 2 humiliating seasons for the Scuderia when they were soundly beaten by what the proud engineer would call the English Assemblatori. However, the latter weren't giving up easily, and Moss routed the might of Modena at Monaco, thanks to his nimble Lotus and his own talent. The 156 powered Phil Hill to the World Championship crown, but it would not be followed up by more success. One would have to wait until the early 70s and the magnificent 312B for a successor. Its flat 12-cylinder 3-litre engine, known as a boxer, could be fitted to a very low semi-monocoque chassis. The car largely dominated the second half of the 1970 season and the start of 1971 and should have taken Jackie X to the championship. It did prove that accusations of the conservatism, often directed at Ferrari, weren't always justified.
La Ferrari ha introdotto moltissime novità, ma alla Ferrari non si fa la pubblicità. Alla Ferrari non si dice noi abbiamo fatto questo, perché è la Ferrari. Io ricordo che è la Ferrari che ha introdotto l'alettone sulle macchine. È la Ferrari che ha incominciato a fare le vetture con un forte effetto suolo quando le altre macchine erano strette. Quando abbiamo fatto la spazzaneve, tutti hanno riso. La spazzaneve è stata la T sperimentale. Quando la T è uscita noi abbiamo vinto tutto. Ma non hanno detto che c'era buona la tenuta di strada, hanno detto che avevamo molti cavalli. Quando vogliono diminuire i meriti della Ferrari dicono che ci sono molti cavalli.
If one omits the Formula 2 period of 1952 and 53, Ferrari's finest hour was with the 312T, the final letter indicating that it was equipped with a transverse gearbox behind the flat 12-cylinder 3-litre engine. This family of cars raced from 1974 to 1980, and its various versions brought no fewer than 3 world titles and 30 victories for drivers Lauda, Regazzoni, Reutemann, Villeneuve and Scheckter, as well as 4 constructors' titles. The 312T marked the golden age of Scuderia Ferrari in Formula 1. But Formula One's history has always run in cycles. At the end of the 50s, Ferrari, the most famous and long-standing of World Championship entrants, was shown the way by just one of those assemblatori of whom he was so disdainful. That man was John Cooper, whose father began by building tiny single-seaters in a small garage in Surbiton, on the outskirts of London. Built for the motorcycle-engined 500cc class, the Cooper's cars were notable for their engines mounted behind the driver, the lightweight tubular chassis and their low price, which allowed British drivers to benefit from what were essentially the first Formula cars in which they could cut their teeth on the way to greater things. Thus was created a whole host of drivers and engineers who formed the base on which was built Britain's superiority in motorsport, which began in the early 60s. One of the most promising graduates of this school was Stirling Moss, who was a teenage purchaser of a Cooper 500. Appropriately then, Moss scored Cooper's first ever Grand Prix victory, his car powered by a 2-litre Coventry Climax in Argentina in 1958. It outclassed the front-engine Ferraris of Musso and Hawthorn in spite of a 500cc handicap. For the first time, the Italian Goliath would have to give best to the English David. Thus began a new era in Formula 1. But it was Jack Brabham more than Moss who symbolised this new era. He was Cooper's works driver, and it was he who claimed the world title in 1959 and 1960.
We went on to prove, really, that the rear-engine car was going to be there to stay, because it did have a lot of advantages over the front-engine car. From a traction point of view, weight distribution, getting the weight over the rear axle, and being able to put the power on the ground, because most of the front-engine cars couldn't put the power on the ground. The development of the engines, and you get a lot more horsepower. If you can't put it on the ground, that's not much use to you. And rear-engine car does really help put the power onto the road.
At that time, general feeling ran against the idea of rear-engine cars simply because it hadn't worked with the hard-to-handle pre-war auto unions. It was thought that the reason the cars handled so badly was because of the engine's positioning. But the Cooper's success proved that to be false. In spite of a fairly basic tubular chassis and a less powerful engine than its Italian rivals, the Coopers proved that low weight and manoeuvrability could compensate for a lack of power, particularly on the most demanding of circuits.